Good morning, ladies. All right. We are excited to have you here for Mothers Together, whether you're joining in person or online or later this evening. My name is Becky, and I'm filling in for Elizabeth for the announcements today. A few reminders about the schedule and Easter and other Mothers Together stuff. So we're in the last week of this little series on the idea of loving our circles, and those are the people who are close to us, our kids, our spouses, our extended family, close friends, work colleagues, and we're asking, how does Christ's love for us impact the way we love and care for those we interact with on a regular basis? So today we have Dr. Felicia Wu Song back for her second part of her talk on living with restless devices. Next week, on April 4th, Brett Corton will kick off our Loving the World series by sharing ideas on how we can talk to our kids and the next generation about gender and sexuality. And then the week after, April 11th, is spring break, so we will not be having a Mothers Together time. Okay, so some Easter announcements. That Sunday is Easter, hooray! And that means that tomorrow is Good Friday, and here at Mountain View at 7 o'clock there is a Good Friday service. There's also an art installation out on the windows right over there that you can go through with your phone and scan the QR codes and get prompts for the artwork if you want to do Stations of the Cross out there. On Sunday, the Easter services are at 8:30, 10, and 11 a.m., and then after the 11 a.m. service here, there's a little egg hunt, I believe, so for kiddos or grown-ups young at heart, maybe. Other events about that are special events. On Saturday, April 20th, there will be a Mothers Together calligraphy morning. So I think it's from 10 to noon. Rosalind Ng will be leading a calligraphy workshop, so there'll be information about registering for that coming up. Our spring celebration events for Mothers Together, Thursday, May 9th is our brunch morning, and then on Saturday, the 11th, there'll be an off-site gathering for those who can't come on Thursday mornings. Gloria Lee is our speaker for the Thursday time. So look for registration coming up in the near future. Okay, I'm going to pray, and then I will introduce Dr. Song. All right, so God, thank you so much for these women and for this community where we can learn and grow with you and hear more about your heart for us. And I pray that you would give us perspective on how we interact with our devices and our friends, and be intentional with being present and having the freedom that you give us versus following the pressures of, the productivity around us. So I pray that you would open our ears to hear from Dr. Song and give us your words of encouragement. Amen. All right. So this week we are again welcoming Dr. Felicia Wu Song. She is a cultural sociologist who studies the place of digital technologies in contemporary life. Her research centers around the rapidly evolving digital technology landscapes of industry and how the adoption of social media and digital devices fundamentally alters the landscapes of family, community, and organizational life. She is author of Restless Devices, Recovering Personhood, Presence, and Place in the Digital Age. She regularly speaks on digital practices, social media, the digital media industry, parenting in the digital age, and spiritual formation at universities, colleges, churches, schools, parents groups, and conferences. Dr. Song lives in Santa Barbara, California with her husband and 2 children, and when she's not working, she enjoys reading children's chapter books, gardening, doing the New York Times crossword puzzles, and daydreams about becoming a bass player. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Song, and go for it. Over to you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and I'm really glad to be with you all again this week. So I hope you all have access to the handout that I had sent in to Elizabeth. It is very much like the one last week where there are just some key terms. I put in some of the longer quotes or the more significant quotes, so I'll try to refer to the handout as I work through my presentation. And again, I apologize, I'm looking at my notes to keep me on track so that I don't end up talking for an hour or spinning off on some rabbit trail. So hopefully can stay within our time frame here. So if you remember last week, I presented this idea of social imaginaries to you from Charles Taylor, and we talked about how the digital social imaginary trains us, or the digital landscape trains us into a story, this digital social imaginary that is very much about permanent connectivity, this kind of state of consciousness in which we're always, in some ways, online. We're always thinking about what's happening in the online spaces, and that's very often connected to a older story, a story about productivity, a culture of productivity that is one that prioritizes productivity above all else, and one in which we find our meaning and our significance through productivity. So last week I ended us just in this sad place of bad news, right? That this place in which we might be living into a social imaginary of productivity, or the one of permanent connectivity that our digital world is persuading us to live in. But I suggested that we needed a new story, right? And certainly people of faith are given an opportunity to live into, or we have resources to live into a new story. One that will push back against what I think is often a ruthless story of productivity, one that is shaped by scarcity, striving, control. And I think in Christianity, we have access to a story that promises abundance and rest and freedom. So I thought I would start us today with an actual story of someone who I think is living out this counter narrative, or this counter social imaginary that we can find in the Christian faith. And I'm drawing from a theologian's work, Emmanuel Katongole, who tells a story about a Catholic archbishop, John Baptist Odama of Uganda. So he says this. So Archbishop Odama is someone who has devoted his life to attempting to forge peace within the government and the Lord's Resistance Army. Again, he's in Uganda. Criticized by both sides, Odama is nevertheless beloved by the local people and is known for coming in his flowing robes to sleep on the streets with the children fleeing from the conflict. And Katongole writes specifically, he says, Odama visits displacement camps, negotiates with rebels, and works tirelessly for peace. He says every day is extremely busy, full of visits, meetings, and negotiations. But on Thursdays, Odama says, I am not available. No one can meet with Odama on Thursdays. He does not go out. That day he spends alone in a chapel, quote, before the Blessed Sacrament. There every week for an entire day, hidden from public view, Odama detaches from the struggle, adores the body of Jesus, listens to and cries out to God, and returns to his community freshly rooted in a deeper vision. And Katongole writes, the public Odama is well known, yet there is no public Odama without the Odama we do not see. The hidden Odama points to what it looks like to belong to God and to keep returning one's work and vision to God. As I read this story today during Holy Week, it makes me think about how perfect this story rings in our ears. Perhaps if we're observing Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and thinking about how Jesus modeled this hiddenness, right? Taking time in the garden to prepare and to belong to God before, as Katongole puts it, returning one's work and vision to God. And so my question today, to start us off, is with the story is to get us to wonder, how do we become more like Odama, right? He's a very busy man. And as I read the list of things that he's doing every day, it makes me think of the life of so many mothers, right? We're doing so many things. How do we cultivate and devote ourselves to a hidden version of ourselves, right? In order to live out the public self. How do we do this in an environment that is bent on keeping us in permanent connectivity? There's nothing in this story that I just told you that suggests that Odama perhaps has the same types of struggles that maybe we do with our digital devices. I don't know. But certainly it's the case that we live in a world where the digital media industries have harnessed all the lead edge insight of behavioral psychology, of brain science, using finely calibrated algorithms to calculate the optimal way to keep us tethered to their sites. Right, these industries are well resourced. They are relying on experts from designers of casinos, right, all trying to colonize our attention, seek new and efficient ways to monetize our most basic needs for relationship and belonging, right? So how is it, right, that we live out this counter narrative, this social imaginary that Christianity has to offer when we are daily confronted with this vast system of persuasion, digital persuasion, right, that we are immersed in? And so what I want to talk about today is to offer you a framework, right? A framework for thinking about how do we realign ourselves to this story of the gospel so that we are, and this is the top on the handout, the quote that I'm leading us with is, so that we can actually find ourselves to be the people who respond to Jesus, who says, yes, as his disciples said, yes, we will abide in you, and Jesus promises to abide in them. Right? How do we be that kind of people instead of being people who abide in the digital and find that the digital abides in us through permanent connectivity? Right? What type of spiritual formation needs to happen? And so one of the paradigms I found useful is viewing digital practice as a form of liturgy. And here I'm drawing specifically from the work of James K.A. Smith, who's a philosopher who wrote the book You Are What You Love. Some of you may have some familiarity with that text already. And in this book, he draws on Augustine and Augustine's understanding of Christian formation and bodily practices. And he suggests that rather than viewing ourselves as human beings primarily as thinkers, maybe we would benefit from also or better appreciating the ways in which we are primarily desiring creatures rather than thinkers. And so Smith starts off with this fancy term that I have on the handout, right? The theological anthropology. It's just the academic term that gets at a picture of what it means to be human in relation to the divine. And so Augustine lays out this perspective that says maybe it's not so much that we are primarily thinkers who are formed by knowledge, by beliefs, by cognitive insight. Rather, maybe we are primarily desiring creatures who are driven by appetite, driven by what we do with our bodies. And this is a very different, right, picture of what it means to be human. And so if we recognize ourselves to be desiring creatures formed by the visceral and the bodily, we might start to re-see how our seemingly mundane routines that we live out with our bodies function to train us towards some kind of goal, some kind of telos, some end, right? Some vision of the good life. And so here I'll turn to this quote, this longer quote here on your handout by Jamie Smith. He writes, "The way our desire gets aimed in specific directions is through practices that shape and mold and direct our loves. Habits are formed by practices, routines that inscribe particular ongoing habits into our character, such that they become secondary nature to us. Some of the habits and practices that we are regularly immersed in are actually thick, formative practices that over time embed in us desires for a particular version of the good life." So there's some interesting points here, right? This idea that our desires are actually formed by habits, right? Our loves are formed by our habits that we perform, that we embody, right, with our corporeal being. And this is interesting, right? Because often we think, oh, I just have desires, right? They're just coming out of me. But this is like, no. We're trained into certain kinds of desires through what we already do day to day. And so we can think about, if we buy this vision of the theological anthropology, like how we function as humans in relation to the divine, we can start to say, okay, so maybe the digital practices of checking our emails and messages, reading our social media feeds when we first wake up, right before we go to bed, in between meetings, waiting online, right? When we're doing that, our desires and our souls are actually being formed. We are being trained towards becoming some kind of person, right? And when we are unreflectively doing this, right, we're just doing the taken for granted norms of what we see around us, we can find ourselves engaging in what Smith calls secular liturgies. And these are personal and cultural habits that, again, we routinely practice with our bodies, which have the effect, he says, of misforming our desires. That is, in the quote on the handout, he says, secular liturgies capture our hearts by capturing our imaginations and draw us into ritual practices that, quote, teach us to love something very different from the kingdom of God. And so, right, he's using this word liturgy, and depending on how familiar you are with actually engaging in liturgy or what you think about that term, he's working with this idea that, right, many of us might be familiar with liturgy in a Sunday morning worship type of practice, right? That we follow a kind of liturgy of worship. And the idea here, my background is having spent many years in Anglican or Episcopal liturgical worship practices, is that all these habits of certain prayers, of kneeling, of standing, of bowing, right? Some of us might have engaged in liturgies of raising their hands in worship, right? All of these can become unreflective, or not unreflective, but they can become routinized in such a way that they are so practiced in our bodies that they're just secondary nature now, right? And they are forming us, right? They are forming a particular picture of who God is and who we are in relation to God when we are worshiping right, with a particular liturgy. And so he's using secular liturgy in the same way, right? We're doing the same type of liturgical practice. We're just adopting unreflectively these cultural digital habits, right? So if we recognize that our bodily routines may in fact be signaling and shaping our desires and our loves, right? Who we are becoming, then we can ask ourselves kind of practical questions like, where in my daily life are there secular liturgies that are directing me away from the kingdom of God, right? Erecting blinders or obstacles to my even recognizing that God is present and that God is speaking, right? How do my digital secular liturgies train me perhaps to devalue or fear what is happening all around me when I bury my face in my screen? Am I missing opportunities to encounter the Christ in the quiet of my spirit or in the holy presence of an unexpected guest who is within my physical proximity? And so that's the first step. We can take a audit, is the term Smith uses. We can assess, right? Where are the secular liturgies in my life? And then what I love about Smith's model and framework here is he recommends that after we do the audit and perhaps we decide, okay, I'm going to try to scale back, right, on some of these habits and liturgies, secular liturgies that are misforming my desires. He says, what we have to do then is also develop counter liturgies, right? These counter liturgies that push back against the misformations of the heart. So instead of simply removing the bad, we ought to also fill ourselves with the good. Why? This is the Augustinian answer. Again, the quote's on your handout. Because our hearts are restless and will remain so until we find our rest in God. Okay, so the idea is not just, we don't just do digital detox. We don't just scale back on how much time I'm on Insta or something like that. We are desiring creatures. We are longing for connection. We are longing for rest. And so we need to develop counter liturgies that actually fill us with that genuine belonging, with that genuine rest. Fill us with the good, right? Because we are inherently desiring creatures with appetites. And so in response to our digital secular liturgies, we can ask, all right, how can I disrupt those digital habits, right? And maybe open myself to an opportunity to taste something different from what I have been doing so far. Can I find some kind of generative approach to redirecting my loves towards experiencing communion with God and with others? And so I think the practical question is, well, okay, where do I go find these counter liturgies? One place certainly is that we can look to our Christian heritage of spiritual disciplines, right? There are years and years of desert fathers and mothers, right, who have practiced and given us resources on the disciplines of silence, solitude, fasting, prayer, lectio divina, right? All of these can be seen not just as disciplines that maybe we practice during Lent, right, and then we stop during Easter, but we can see them anew as counter liturgies that maybe actively push back against the subtle ways in which our digital practices are malforming us. Another approach to counter liturgies that I've been interested in is the idea of taking up experiments. And what I mean by this is creating circumstances for ourselves that kind of move us slightly outside of our comfort zones and maybe, again, develop a new taste for a different kind of living, a new way of being that moves us closer to experiencing that communion with God and others that we long for. And so I want to talk about two kinds of experiments, practical experiments that we might consider trying, and maybe one of them is appealing to you that you might consider as well. So one thing we can do is, and I've tried these experiments myself. I always say I'm the mad scientist that always tries experiments on herself before she recommends them to others, is A counter liturgy that addresses this tendency towards permanent connectivity, that is digital ubiquity, like always allowing the digital to permeate all times, all spaces in my life. So what can I do to try to create sacred places or sacred spaces? I see on my handout, I actually listed as the second one. So I'm doing the protecting sacred space and time experiment first. So what can we do to create these places that are perhaps tech-free, that we delineate as this is the place for rest, this is the place for communion, right? This is the place for quiet, or this is the place for freedom. Maybe it's a bedroom, maybe it's a dining table, maybe it's a particular tree that's on the walk that you always take, right? That we say that's going to be tech-free, and it's a sacred place in which I'm not going to feel any pull towards my technologies because my tech is not here. Or maybe it's sacred times. Maybe that's 15 minutes after I wake up, 15 minutes before I go to bed. I'm just going to be tech-free, right? And I'm going to let myself hear my thoughts, whether they are chaotic or calm. Maybe in the morning I'm going to wake up and not just go to my phone, but I'm actually going to open the windows and see what's happening out there, smell the coffee, look at the people I'm living with, and not be bombarded by all the other details and plans of the day yet. Just 15 minutes, right, of protection, of sacredness, right, where we can be with ourselves, with God, with the people in our lives. So I recommend these as, I use the word experiment. These are not self-help. These are not New Year's resolutions. These are not ways to make myself a better person. Experiments are ways of gathering data, right? There's no failing or succeeding. It's just, let's find out what happens. We get information about ourselves, and we discover whether there might be a potential for a counter liturgy, right? That we might discover, I really love these 15 minutes that I am not on a device, and I'm going to keep doing that because it's so life-giving, right? And maybe we find that, or maybe we find those 15 minutes to be impossible. We're stressed out. We can't do 15 minutes. We find 5 minutes is all we can do, and we have to, we're overwhelmed, and we want to check our phones for whatever reason. So whatever that might be, whenever we struggle with an experiment, right? It's not a failure. It's data, right? It's saying, okay, I'm struggling. We ask ourselves, what is that about? Right? We might even bring it into our prayer lives and ask, okay, Lord, I don't know what this is about. I don't know how to get over this anxiety. I don't know how to not want to check in these 15 minutes or not want to check in this space. Show me, right? Bring this into the conversation that you may already be having with God about your life. So that's sacred times and sacred places. The second experiment is, as you see on the handout, monotasking. And as you can guess, this is the one that is meant to address the secular liturgy of multitasking on our digital devices. And so when we engage in monotasking, it is what it sounds like. It is doing one thing and only one thing. I know that sounds maybe pretty basic and maybe kind of odd and antithetical to every fiber in your body. Right? But that's part of the experiment, right? So 3 possible spaces to do monotasking, okay? So when you are eating on your own, maybe instead of watching something or going through your emails, what would it be like to just eat? When you're doing a house chore, laundry, cooking, right? Instead of doing lots of other things, like, what would it be like to just do that one thing? Highly inefficient, I understand. But what would it be like to just cook or do laundry? And be letting ourselves have that quiet, or be thinking about the people who we're cooking for or whose laundry we are doing. Right? And I understand, depending on your cooking and your laundry situation, maybe there's tons of noise and it just doesn't make any sense at all. This one I've tried when we are driving. That is when you're alone, not when you're with other people. When you're driving alone, so maybe you've dropped off your kids at school. What would it be like to just come home and on that drive, just drive, monotask, right? Not listen to anything, not call anyone, right? Just drive. And this is the one I've tried and I've been fascinated by my own response, right? In the beginning, it was awful. I was like breaking out in a cold sweat because I was so used to like listening to something. It was just dead silence, right? But as I kept doing it over and over again, the 10 minutes of dropping my kids off from school and coming back home became an incredibly beautiful 10 minutes of quiet. The only time when nobody could reach me, no one could ask me to do something. And it was just beautiful time of processing my own thoughts, of starting to pray, crying if I need to cry, whatever it is, just monotasking when I'm driving. And again, the idea is to just gather information, find out about yourself. Maybe it becomes a counter liturgy. Maybe it becomes a life-giving source. And that's the way we can kind of push back against some of the tendencies of where our digital practices tend to move us. These practices that we're not necessarily going to be able to stop, right? I can't stop doing email. I can't stop messaging and texting because it's all part of my life. But maybe I can bring in these counter liturgies that kind of reshape, push back against having those habits just kind of shape me in a whole holistic way towards a digital social imaginary rather than the gospel one. So I'm noting my time here. I'm just going to close here. I see. I want to end with this idea of liturgy being the work of the people. Right? This is what it means in the Greek. And I love this idea of liturgy not being an individual practice. And I think so many of us think of technology and our digital practices in terms of like the individual, right? It's just what each of us does, and we all have different habits and so forth. And I think there's a reality to that. But at the same time, if we think about how our secular liturgies, right, being on social media, being on email, all of those are done collectively, right? We email, we're on social media because everybody else is doing it. We're doing the work of the people. And so one of the ideas that I'd like to suggest for you to think about is what would it be like if we practice our secular liturgies already collectively? What would it be like to develop bodily counter liturgies also in a collective community, family, small group, whatever it is, sense, right? So that we're doing this together, not just alone, because I think in the end of the day, we certainly have to make our own individual commitments and boundaries. But in the end of the day, it's going to be the work of the people, right? This communal effort in counter liturgies that proves most effective and sustainable. All right, I'm going to stop there and hope that this gives you lots of good fodder to kick around with each other in your discussion groups. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Song. I don't know if you can hear me still, but that was awesome. I really appreciate the idea of liturgy as not just like a habit. Like you hear the habits all the time, like habit forming, habit breaking, but it's like this is liturgy. It's like a practice and a community practice. So that was cool.